There is a particular kind of woman the world does not see coming. Not because she hides herself, but because the world has decided, long before it meets her, that a woman of her age and her circumstance has already arrived at the end of what she is capable of. The world has filed her away. It has made its assessment and moved on. And that woman, the one the world stopped watching, is exactly the one you need to keep your eyes on. Because what happens when no one is looking is often the most important thing that will ever happen. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 71 years old. And on the morning of the day her life began again, she was standing in the parking lot of a county social services office with a garbage bag containing everything she still owned, watching a pigeon eat a French fry off the asphalt and thinking, with the clear and almost peaceful lucidity that arrives when a person has finally run out of ways to pretend a situation is something other than what it is, that she had never in 46 years of marriage imagined it would end like this. Not the marriage ending. She had imagined that, in the private and honest hours of very early morning when the mind does what the daylight hours will not permit. She had imagined it with the specific clarity of a woman who has lived alongside a man for nearly 5 decades and knows him in the way of long proximity, which is to say she knew the full shape of him, the good and the not good together, without illusion. She had known for some time that the marriage was not what it had been, though she could not have pointed to the precise moment it had changed. These things do not change in a moment. They change in the accumulation of small withdrawals, each one barely perceptible, until you look up one day and find that what was full is now empty and you cannot account for exactly when it happened. What she had not imagined, what she could not have constructed in even her most honest early morning accounting, was this. A garbage bag. A parking lot. A pigeon. The French fry and the particular quality of morning light in March that was bright without being warm, that illuminated everything without offering any comfort. She had not imagined that after 46 years, after the raising of 2 children and the building of a household and the 10,000 ordinary days that constitute a life shared with another person, she would be left with this. A garbage bag. The clothes inside it. Her reading glasses. The paperback she'd been reading the week it happened, her bookmark still in it at page 112 as though she had simply stepped away and would be back to finish it. A photograph of her children when they were small, taken on a beach somewhere, she could not now remember which one, squinting into the sun and laughing. A phone with a cracked screen. $23 and the change she'd found in the bottom of the bag when she was packing it. $23 and the change. After 46 years. His name was Dale Calloway and he had been, for the great majority of those 46 years, a man she had believed she knew. Quiet in the particular way of men who are more comfortable with action than language. Reliable in the practical sense, the car maintained, the roof repaired when it needed repairing, the bills paid on the first of the month with the consistency of someone for whom financial disorder was a personal affront. He had worked for 30 years in agricultural equipment sales, had traveled for it, had been gone 3 or 4 days a week for much of their marriage, and Ruth had learned to build her days around his absence the way you build around a structural feature of a house, not resenting it, simply incorporating it into the shape of things. She had not been unhappy. This was the thing she returned to most often in the weeks after. She had not been unhappy. She had been, for most of those years, something more sustainable than happy, which was content. She had found meaning in the children, in the house, in the garden she had built over 30 years at the property on Millhaven Road, in the friendships she had maintained with a small number of women she had known since before the marriage, in the church she attended on Sundays with a faith that was quiet and personal and did not require performance. She had found meaning in the ordinary work of a life, the cooking and the canning and the care of living things and the management of a household, and she had not, for the most part, felt that these things were less than what she had wanted. They were what she had wanted. They were what she had chosen. The savings account had been in his name. She had known this and had not thought about it in the way you do not think about the structural integrity of a floor you have walked on every day for decades. It was simply there. It was simply a thing that was. She had never had reason to question it, and so she had not questioned it, and this, she understood now with the retrospective clarity of someone examining a sequence of events from the far end of them, had been a mistake of such magnitude that she could not quite look at it directly. He had taken it the day he left. The full amount, which was $211,000, the savings of a lifetime, the money they had spoken of as the foundation of their retirement, the money that was in his name in an account she had never had independent access to and that he had withdrawn in a single transaction the morning he drove away. He had left while she was at her friend Marjorie's house for their weekly Tuesday coffee. She had come home at 11:15 to find his closet empty and his truck gone and the account, which she had checked for the first time and she could not honestly say how long, at zero. There had been a note. She had kept it, not out of sentiment but because she thought she might need it for legal purposes, and she had been right about that, though the legal purposes had not produced the result she had needed them to produce. The note was 3 sentences. It said that he was sorry, that he needed a different life, and that he hoped she would be all right. 3 sentences after 46 years. She had read them standing in the kitchen of the house on Millhaven Road with her coat still on and her keys still in her hand, and she had felt something she could not immediately name, something that was not quite grief and not quite anger and not quite shock because some part of her, the honest early morning part, had perhaps known that something like this was coming and had simply not allowed itself to know it consciously, because the conscious version was too large to carry. The house was not hers. She had not known this. She had believed, for the full 46 years of the marriage, that it was theirs. She had lived in it as if it were hers. She had tended it, improved it, spent 30 years making it into something beautiful. She had planted the garden that now covered the south side of the property in a succession of seasonal color that the neighbors had photographed and complimented for years. She had refinished the floors in the kitchen herself at 58, kneeling on the hardwood for 3 days straight, her back aching, her hands raw, because she had loved that kitchen and she had wanted it to be right. The deed had been in his name. She had not known this either, or had known it once, at the beginning, when the house was purchased and the paperwork had been handled and she had signed what she was told to sign and had not examined the implications with the attention they deserved because she had been 31 years old and newly married and the idea that she needed to examine the implications had not occurred to her. It occurred to her now. It occurred to her with the force of a thing that has been waiting to occur for a very long time. He had transferred the deed 3 years before he left. She did not know this until the attorney told her, a younger woman with a careful manner and very clear eyes who had gone through the paperwork with a thoroughness that Ruth had found both painful and necessary. He had transferred the deed to an LLC that was his alone. The attorney had explained this in the language of legal processes and structural arrangements, and Ruth had listened and understood, in the way of someone translating from a language they have only recently learned, that what this meant in plain terms was that she had no claim to the house. That the house, the 30 years of her care and attention and the garden and the kitchen floors and the 30 Christmases and the summer evenings on the porch, was not legally hers and had not been legally hers for 3 years while she had gone on living in it and tending it and believing it to be the ground beneath her. Her daughter was named Patricia. Patricia was 43 and lived in another state with her husband and her 3 children and a life that had no room in it, not from cruelty, Ruth did not believe it was cruelty, but from the specific compression of a household in which 2 people are working full-time and raising children and managing a mortgage and cannot, in any practical sense, absorb the needs of a displaced parent without something giving way. Patricia had offered what she could. She had cried on the phone. She had called every day for the first 2 weeks. She had sent money twice, modest amounts that Ruth had accepted with the particular gratitude of someone who understands that the gift is larger than its size. Her son was named Craig. Craig was 40 and had been, for the past 8 years, not quite estranged but not quite present either, separated from the family by a distance that was partly geographic and partly something else, something that had developed between Craig and his father in the years before Dale left and that Ruth had never been able to fully understand because neither of them had explained it to her. Craig had called once after Dale left. He had been kind in the telephone way of someone who is sorry but does not know what to do with the sorrow. He had not called again, or had called and left messages she had returned and the calls had gone to voicemail, and eventually the pattern of their contact had settled back into what it had been before, which was occasional and careful and not quite enough. She had stayed in the house on Millhaven Road for 3 months after Dale left. She had stayed because she had nowhere to go and because leaving had felt like a defeat she was not yet ready to accept, and because some part of her had believed, through those 3 months, that the legal process the attorney had set in motion would produce some result, some recognition that 46 years of contribution to a household constituted a claim that could not simply be erased by a deed transfer and an LLC. The attorney had been honest with her from the beginning. The attorney had told her the odds clearly and without false comfort. Ruth had understood the odds and had hoped anyway, because hope was what she had and because the alternative was to stop hoping, and she could not do that. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. The LLC had filed. The timeline was 60 days. The attorney had done what could be done, which was not enough, and had said so with the genuine sorrow of someone who finds the legal outcome unjust and is constrained by the law as it stands rather than as it should be. Ruth had packed a garbage bag. She had not taken more than that, not because she had no right to more but because the act of taking more had seemed, in the moment of packing, like a prolongation of something she needed to be finished with. She took the clothes and the reading glasses and the paperback and the photograph and the phone and the $23 and the change. She took one other thing, which was a key on a plain steel ring that she had found, on the last evening she spent in the house on Millhaven Road, in a drawer of Dale's desk that she had opened looking for a pen. She had not known what the key opened. She had not known she was looking for it. But when she found it, something in her hand recognized it in the way the body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up, and she had put it in the pocket of her coat without examining why, and she had carried it with her to the parking lot of the county social services office and the pigeon and the French fry and the beginning of the rest of her life. The county social services office was staffed, on that March morning, by a woman named Helen who was in her 50s and had the particular manner of someone who has spent decades receiving people in crisis and has learned to be genuinely useful without performing either alarm or false cheerfulness. Helen had a warmth that was not performed. She listened to Ruth's situation with full attention and made notes and provided information in the clear and practical sequence of someone who understands that what a person in Ruth's position needs most is not sympathy but specificity. She told Ruth what was available. She told her what was not. She was honest about the waiting lists and the timelines and the limitations of what the system could offer a 71-year-old woman with no income and no fixed address. Ruth listened and made her own notes on a piece of paper Helen provided. She had always been a note-taker. It was a habit from the years of managing the household, of keeping track of the children's appointments and the household maintenance schedules and the grocery lists and the dozens of administrative threads that constitute the running of a family. The habit of documentation had served her well for 46 years and it was serving her now, though what she was documenting had changed considerably. Helen mentioned, in the course of the conversation, a county property that had come into the system through a tax delinquency process. It was agricultural land, she said, north of the county line, about 22 miles from town. It had been on the county's delinquent property list for some time. There was a structure on it, an old farmhouse, the condition of which she could not speak to, as she had not seen it. There was also, the county records showed, a secondary structure of some kind, a barn or outbuilding, she was not certain. The property had last been assessed 11 years ago and the records were incomplete. She said this as a piece of information, not as a recommendation. She was not suggesting Ruth do anything with it. She was simply reading from the list of county assets that might be available for various programs, and this one happened to be on the list because no one had yet determined what to do with it, and the county had been, in the manner of county governments, slow to decide. Ruth wrote down the address. She wrote it because she was a note-taker and because when someone offers you information, you write it down, because you cannot know in the moment of receiving information which piece of it will matter. She wrote it on the same piece of paper as the waiting list numbers and the shelter address and the food bank hours. She put the piece of paper in her coat pocket alongside the key on the plain steel ring. She did not connect them yet. The key and the address. She did not sit in the parking lot and have a revelation. She was not, by nature or by circumstance, a woman given to revelations. She was a woman given to working through things methodically, one step at a time, in the order in which they needed to be worked through. She had been given a shelter address, and that was the next step, and she was going to take it. The shelter was clean and the staff were kind, and the room she was given, shared with a woman named Dottie who was 68 and whose situation had its own particular shape of unfairness, was small but sufficient. Ruth unpacked her garbage bag with the methodical attention she brought to all practical tasks and arranged what she had on the shelf above the bed and in the small shared closet with a neatness that was not performance but simply how she operated. She had always believed that the way you treated your space was the way you treated yourself, and she was not going to stop believing that because the space was 8 by 10 feet and the shelf was particle board. She lay on the bed that first night and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. She thought about the house on Millhaven Road and tried not to think about it with the specific effort of someone who knows that the thinking will not be useful. She thought about the garden, which she had started from almost nothing the year after they moved in, which was now, 30 years later, the most beautiful thing she had ever made with her hands, and which would be maintained or destroyed by whoever came next with no knowledge of what it had cost and what it had meant and how many mornings she had spent on her knees in it with the earth under her fingernails and the particular satisfaction of a thing growing in the way you had hoped it would grow. She thought about the key in her coat pocket. She had put the coat over the back of the chair and she lay on the bed and she thought about the key and the address on the piece of paper and the 22 miles north of the county line and the farmhouse, the condition of which no one could speak to. She thought about Dale. She thought about him with the controlled and focused quality of someone who has learned to examine a painful thing without being destroyed by it. She thought about the 46 years of a man she had believed she knew and she turned over, in the accountant's way she was developing, what she actually knew versus what she had assumed. The assumptions were extensive. The things she actually knew with legal certainty were considerably fewer. She thought about the key that she had found in his desk on the last evening in the house on Millhaven Road, and she thought about the fact that she had never seen it before, had never known what drawer it came from or what it opened, and she thought about the address on the piece of paper, and she thought about the county's incomplete records and the secondary structure of uncertain nature, and she thought, 22 miles north of the county line is not very far. She slept eventually. When she woke in the morning, Dottie was already up and there was the sound of the shelter beginning its day, the institutional sounds of a shared space coming to life. Ruth sat up. She put on her coat. She put her hand in the pocket and felt the key on its plain steel ring, and she felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the specific quality of humiliation that attaches to sleeping in a shelter at 71 when you have spent your life doing everything you were supposed to do, something else. Something smaller and more tentative. Something she could not quite name yet but that she was not going to dismiss. She was going to find the farm. She was going to do it that day, because waiting was not going to produce any information that going would not produce, and she had spent enough of her life waiting for things to resolve themselves. She went to breakfast in the common room. She ate what was provided with the appreciation of someone who has learned, over the past 3 months, not to take a meal for granted. She borrowed a county map from the resource shelf by the door, the kind that was already 3 years out of date but that showed county roads and property boundaries, and she found the road that matched the address Helen had given her, and she traced it with her finger 22 miles north of the county line to where it ended at a property marker. She borrowed Dottie's phone charger and charged her cracked phone to 60%. She called a car service because the shelter was not within walking distance of a bus route that went north. She spent $11 of her $23 on the ride. She sat in the back seat with the county map on her lap and watched the town give way to the edges of the county and then to the open land north of it, the agricultural land that had a different quality of light than the town, flatter and wider, the sky taking up more of what you could see. The driver left her at the end of a gravel road that had a rusted metal gate across it and a weathered sign that said the property number and nothing else. She stood at the gate and looked down the road toward where it disappeared into a line of old trees, and she breathed in the particular smell of early March farmland, cold earth and dried grass and the faint promise of something that had not yet begun. She had grown up near land like this. She had not been near it in many years. Her body remembered it before her mind had time to catch up. The gate was padlocked. She stood at it and looked at the padlock, and then she put her hand in her coat pocket and took out the key on the plain steel ring, and she held it in her palm for a moment. She looked at the key. She looked at the padlock. The padlock was old, the same age of rust and weathering as the gate itself, the same deep brownish red of metal that has been exposed to decades of weather without attention. She stepped forward. She put the key in the padlock. She turned it. It opened. She stood with the open padlock in her hand and the gate in front of her and 22 miles of county road behind her and the farm, whatever it was, whatever state it was in and whatever it contained, waiting at the end of the gravel road beyond the line of old trees. She stood there for a full minute. She was not a woman given to dramatic pauses. She was a woman given to the next step. But she stood there for a full minute because the key had fit, and the key fitting meant something she could not yet measure, and she wanted to give it the moment it deserved before she moved forward into what it meant. Then she pushed the gate open and she walked through. The gravel road was longer than it had appeared from the gate. She walked it slowly, not because she was tired, though she was tired in the deep-settled way of someone who has not slept well in weeks, but because she had learned over 71 years that the first time you walk towards something important, you should walk it at the pace that allows you to actually see it. She had learned this in the garden, where the difference between a plant that needed water and a plant that needed something else entirely was visible only to someone who was moving slowly enough to look. The trees on either side of the road were old. She could see that from the diameter of their trunks and the way their canopy, bare still in early March, had the particular density of branches that comes from decades of growth without interference. They were mostly oak with some ash mixed in, and they had been allowed to grow in their natural shape without the pruning or management that younger trees on maintained property received, which meant they had taken the shapes they wanted rather than the shapes someone had decided they should have, and the shapes they had taken were magnificent in the specific way of old things that had been left to become fully themselves. The road curved slightly past the tree line and the farm opened in front of her. She stopped walking. She had not known what to expect. She had prepared herself, in the practical way she prepared herself for difficult things, for the possibility that it was a ruin, that the structure was compromised beyond use, that the land itself was in a state that made it more problem than resource. She had told herself, on the car ride north, that she was simply going to look, simply going to gather information, and that information, whatever it was, would be better than the uncertainty of not knowing. She had not prepared herself for this. The farmhouse was large. Not large in the way of a house built to impress, but large in the way of a house built to house a working family through a working life, with room for the things that a working life requires. 2 stories, wood frame construction, the original boards visible beneath layers of paint that had weathered and peeled through what was clearly many years of neglect but that had not compromised the underlying structure, which was, from where she stood, straight-walled and square-cornered with the particular solidity of buildings raised by people who understood that what they were building needed to last. The roof had lost some shingles on the west slope and there was a section of porch railing that had given way at some point and not been repaired, and the windows were clouded with the film of years, but the windows were intact. Every one of them. She counted them from the road without consciously deciding to count. 14 windows and every one of them whole. To the east of the house was a barn, old and enormous, the kind that had not been built in this part of the country for 60 or 70 years because the economics of farming had changed and the buildings that the old economics required were no longer constructed. The barn siding had silvered in the way of unpainted wood that has been exposed to weather across decades, and 2 of the upper boards on the north face had warped loose from their nails, but the structure was standing with the authority of something built with timber heavy enough to outlast the people who cut it. South of the barn, set slightly apart from both the house and the barn at the edge of what had once been a kitchen garden, the evidence of which was visible in the geometric regularity of the raised beds that had not been tended but had not been entirely reclaimed by the surrounding land either, was a third structure. Smaller than the barn and different in character from the outbuildings she had seen on other farm properties. It was square, perhaps 15 feet on each side, built of stone rather than wood, with a roof that had been replaced at some point more recently than the rest of the property, the shingles darker and less weathered than what was on the farmhouse. It had a single door, heavy, made of wood planks banded with iron, and no windows. Whatever it was, it had been built to keep something in, or to keep something out, or both. She looked at it for a moment longer than she looked at anything else on the property. Then she looked away and began to walk toward the house. The front porch held her weight. She tested it carefully, the way she had learned to test uncertain surfaces, pressing her foot down and waiting before committing, and the boards were solid. Old and in need of paint and in need of the railing repair, but solid. She crossed to the front door and found it unlocked, the latch long since ceased to engage properly, and she pushed it open and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and cold and old wood and the faint mineral smell of a chimney that had not been used in years. The entry hall opened immediately into a large front room that ran the full width of the house, with windows on 3 sides and a stone fireplace on the north wall that was, from what she could see without getting closer to examine it, intact. The floors were wide plank pine, the original floors, thick with dust but unwarped, the grain visible through the grime with the warmth that old pine holds even under neglect. She crossed the front room to the kitchen. The kitchen was the largest room on the ground floor. It had clearly been the center of the house's working life, the room around which everything else had been organized. There was a wood-burning range against the east wall, cast iron, old but the kind of old that is permanent rather than fragile, the kind of equipment that was built in an era when built to last was not a selling point but simply a standard. There was a hand pump at the kitchen sink that she recognized from her childhood on her grandmother's property, the kind that connected to a well. She worked the handle experimentally and felt resistance and then heard, from somewhere below the floor, the movement of water. She worked it 3 more times and water came, brown at first and then clearing, cold from the pipe and the underground from which it was drawn. She stood at the sink with the water running clear over her hand and felt something that was not yet hope but was in the neighborhood of it, close enough that she could feel its warmth from where she stood. She went upstairs. 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a sink and facilities that had been disconnected at some point, the water shut off at the supply valve under the sink in the way of someone who had closed the house with the intention of returning and had not returned. She went back downstairs. She went through the kitchen to the back door and out into the yard. She walked to the stone building. Up close it was more substantial than it had appeared from the road. The stones were fitted with the precision of someone who had understood masonry, not a dry stack wall but a mortared construction, the joints tight and the courses level in a way that spoke of skill and intention. The door, which she had seen from the road, was iron-banded oak, the oak dark with age and the iron surface rusted but structurally sound. There was a lock. Not a padlock but a built-in lock, a heavy mortise lock of the kind that was common a century ago and that required a specific key. A key of a specific size and weight that was different from the key she had used at the gate. She put her hand in her pocket. She took out the key on the plain steel. Ring. She looked at it. She looked at the lock. The key was old, the same era as the lock, the same design language, the same weight of iron in the hand. She stepped forward. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. It did not open. She stood for a moment with the key in the lock and the lock unmoving and breathed through the disappointment with the patience of someone who has been breathing through disappointments for a very long time. Then she examined the key more carefully and she examined the lock more carefully and she understood that the key was close but not correct, that there was a slight difference in the profile of the key's bit and the profile that the lock required, close enough that they spoke the same language but not quite the same key. There was another key somewhere. This key, the one that had opened the gate, was one of a set. The key that opened the stone building was the other one. And she did not have it. Not yet. She stepped back from the door and looked at the stone building and the iron-banded door and the mortise lock and she thought, with the methodical patience that was her particular quality, that there were things you found immediately and things you found later and that the difference between the two was usually effort and time and the willingness to keep looking. She would keep looking. She went back to the farmhouse. She went through it again, more slowly this time, the way you go through something the second time when you have stopped trying to form an overall impression and have started looking for specifics. She opened every cabinet and every closet and every drawer she could find. She found the accumulated residue of a life that had been lived here and then stopped being lived here, a stack of old farming publications from the 1980s, their covers faded to the same pale brown, a collection of mason jars in a kitchen cabinet, clean and empty and arranged with the neatness of someone who had intended to use them, a set of hand tools hung on a pegboard in the back hallway, each one on its designated hook, the hooks labeled in pencil with the tool's name in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal, a child's drawing tacked to the inside of a closet door in one of the upstairs bedrooms, a house and a barn and stick figures in a yard, drawn in crayon and signed in the careful printing of a young child learning to write, Bobby, 1974. She stood in the closet doorway and looked at Bobby's drawing for a while. She thought about the child who had made it. She thought about what it meant that the drawing was still here, still tacked to the inside of the closet door, that whoever had closed this house had not taken it or destroyed it but had left it exactly where the child had put it, as if preserving it were a kind of faith in the possibility of return. In the desk in the small room off the front hallway, which had been used as an office or study of some kind, she found papers. Old papers, organized in folders that had dried and stiffened with age but that held their contents intact. Land records. Tax receipts. Correspondence. She sat at the desk chair, which held her weight with the solidity of furniture built in an era when furniture was built to last, and she read through what she found with the careful attention she had brought to important documents her entire adult life. The property had been registered in 1931 to a man named Earl Voss. Earl Voss had farmed it for 30 years and had passed it to his son, Robert Voss, in 1961. Robert Voss, Bobby, she thought, looking up at the ceiling for a moment, had farmed it through the 1970s and into the 1980s. The tax records stopped in 1987. After 1987, there was nothing. No transfer of deed. No further tax payments. No record of sale. Simply a cessation, as if the property had been forgotten, or as if the person managing it had stopped being able to manage it and had simply walked away from the paperwork the way you walk away from something too painful to continue facing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She put the papers back in their folders. She sat at the desk for a moment in the particular quiet of the farmhouse, which was a different quiet from the quiet of the shelter or the quiet of the house on Millhaven Road. It was the quiet of a place that had once been full of sound and had not forgotten it, the way a room that has held music still holds its shape after the music has stopped. She thought about Dale. She thought about the key and the farm and the county's incomplete records and the fact that the property had been on the delinquent tax list for 11 years according to Helen's files, which meant the taxes had stopped around 2012 or 2013, which meant that Robert Voss or whoever had last been responsible for the property had been managing it in some fashion until then and had then stopped. She thought about Dale's desk and the drawer she had opened looking for a pen and the key that had been there, and she thought about the 46 years of a marriage in which she had apparently not known everything she should have known. She thought, Dale knew this farm. She did not know yet what that meant. She did not know yet the shape of what she was standing in the middle of. But she thought it with the certainty of a conclusion that has arrived from multiple directions at once, from the key that fit the gate and the farm that was on no list she had been given and the county records that stopped in 1987 and the 11 years of unpaid taxes and Dale's desk and the drawer she had opened looking for a pen. She thought it and held it and did not push it further than the evidence warranted, because she had learned over 71 years that the distance between what you know and what you suspect is the distance where the most important mistakes are made. She went back to town. She spent the afternoon at the public library, which was free and warm and had computer terminals available for public use. She searched the county property records database, which was accessible online though incomplete in the way of county government databases that have been digitized without full historical conversion. She found the entry for the farm, the property number and the address and the delinquency status and the notation that the property had been flagged for review without any indication of what the review had concluded or whether it had concluded at all. She searched for Robert Voss. She found an obituary in the county newspaper archive, dated 2009. Robert Allen Voss, aged 62, had died in March of 2009 after a brief illness. He was survived by no immediate family. He had farmed the property on County Road 7 for many years, the obituary said, and had been known in the community for his skill with machinery and his reliability as a neighbor. There was no mention of what had happened to the property after his death. There was no mention of an estate or a will or a transfer of ownership. She sat at the library terminal and read the obituary twice. Then she searched for the connection she was now certain existed. She searched for Dale Calloway and Robert Voss together and found nothing on the first search and nothing on the second and then on the third. Searching through a different combination of terms, she found a small item in the county agricultural newspaper from 1989. A photograph of the regional equipment sales conference, a group of men in a meeting room, and the caption beneath it listing the names. Dale Calloway was third from the left. Robert Voss was second from the right. They were standing in the same photograph at the same conference in 1989, 2 years after the property record stopped and 20 years before Robert Voss died alone without immediate family. She printed the photograph. She sat for a moment with the printout in her hand. She was not yet angry, or not only angry. She was something more complicated than angry, something that had anger in it and grief in it and a cold and focused clarity in it that was neither of those things but that was perhaps more useful than either. She returned to the shelter. She ate dinner in the common room with Dottie, who was a woman of considerable humor and no self-pity, qualities Ruth found restorative. She did not tell Dottie what she had found. She was not ready to tell anyone yet. She was still moving through the information in the methodical way she moved through difficult things, one step at a time, in the order in which they needed to be understood. That night she made a list. Not a dramatic list, not a plan for confrontation or revelation. A practical list, the kind she had been making her entire adult life, organized by category and priority and a realistic assessment of what was achievable from where she was standing. The list had 3 categories: what she knew, what she needed to find out, and what she needed to do. What she knew: the farm existed. The key fit the gate. A second key existed somewhere that fit the stone building. Dale had known Robert Voss. Robert Voss had died without heirs in 2009. The property had been in tax delinquency since approximately 2012. The county had incomplete records. What she needed to find out: the current legal status of the property. Whether a will existed for Robert Voss and if so what it said. What the stone building contained. Whether Dale's connection to Robert Voss extended to the property itself and in what form. What she needed to do: speak to the county property office. Find a way back to the farm. Find the second key. She looked at the list for a moment. Then she added a 4th item to the 3rd category, below find the second key, and the item was, do not tell Patricia yet. Not because she was keeping it from her daughter, but because what she had was still only the outline of something, and outlines require filling in before they can bear the weight of another person's hope. The county property office opened at 8:30. She was there at 8:25, standing on the sidewalk outside with her coat buttoned against the March cold and the printout from the library in her pocket alongside the key and the piece of paper with the address. The woman at the counter was young and efficient and navigated the property records database with the speed of someone who had spent years in the system and knew its architecture without having to think about it. The farm on County Road 7, she said, was in a complicated status. The original owner of record was the estate of Robert Allen Voss, deceased 2009. The estate had been administered through the county probate process, she said, pulling up the records with a few keystrokes, but the probate had been contested and the contest had not been fully resolved, and the resolution that had been reached was in the county legal records rather than the property records, which was why the database showed incomplete information. Ruth asked what the resolution had been. The young woman looked at the screen for a moment. She said she would need to pull the associated legal file. She disappeared into the back office for several minutes and returned with a folder, the physical kind, and she opened it on the counter and read through it with the focused attention of someone translating between the legal language of the document and the plain language she was going to use to explain it. The estate of Robert Allen Voss, she said, had been contested by a single claimant. The claimant had presented documentation asserting a relationship to the deceased and a claim under the terms of a private agreement that predated Robert Voss's death. The probate court had reviewed the claim and had issued a ruling in 2011 that the claim had partial merit. The court had determined that the property could not be transferred to the claimant as claimed because the documentation was insufficient to establish the full legal basis for the transfer, but that the property could not be sold or transferred to any other party until the claim was fully resolved. The property had been placed in a holding status, which meant the taxes continued to accrue and no one paid them because neither the estate nor the claimant had legal authority to manage the property in its holding status, and the holding status had never been lifted because the claimant had stopped pursuing the legal process in 2012 and the matter had remained unresolved. Ruth looked at the folder. She asked if she could see the name of the claimant. The young woman turned the folder so Ruth could read the relevant section. The claimant's name was Dale Calloway. She stood at the counter and read the name and she breathed. She breathed in the careful and deliberate way she had been breathing through large things for the past several months. The county property office was warm and fluorescent lit and there was the sound of a copier running somewhere in the back and a phone ringing and the young woman was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who is not sure whether to say something and has decided to wait. Ruth looked up from the folder. She said, in the steady voice that was the voice she used when she needed to be steady, that she appreciated the information. She asked whether the holding status could be addressed through a new legal filing. The young woman said that was a question for an attorney. Ruth said she understood and thanked her and she took her coat and her key and her printout and she walked back out into the March morning. She stood on the sidewalk. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the key on its plain steel ring. Dale had tried to claim this farm after Robert Voss died and had failed, and the failure had left the property in a legal limbo that no one had resolved for 13 years. Dale had kept the gate key. Dale had left, with all their savings, and had gone somewhere she could not find him, and somewhere in whatever life he had built or was building, he either knew or did not know that the farm was still there, still unresolved, still sitting behind its rusted gate with its stone building and its locked door and whatever it was that the stone building contained. She thought about 46 years. She thought about what it means to share a life with a person and not know the full shape of what they are carrying. She thought about the photographs in the desk at the farm, Bobby's drawing on the closet door, the mason jars arranged with such neatness by someone who intended to return. She thought about Robert Voss dying in 2009 without immediate family, and about the fact that he had known Dale Calloway since at least 1989, which was 20 years of knowing each other, and she thought about what it means to know someone for 20 years and to die without immediate family and to leave behind a farm in a complicated legal status with a gate that opened with a key that ended up in a desk drawer. She began to walk. She did not have a destination yet, but she was not the kind of woman who stood still when she needed to think. She walked and she thought, and by the time she had walked 6 blocks she had the outline of the next thing. Not the full picture. She was still missing the full picture. But the outline was clearer than it had been that morning and clearer than it had been yesterday and the day before that, and the direction it pointed was back to the farm, back to the stone building, back to the lock that the key in her pocket almost but did not quite fit. She needed the second key. She thought about where the second key might be. She thought about Dale's desk and the drawer she had opened looking for a pen. She had taken the key she found. She had not, in the urgency of that last evening in the house on Millhaven Road, gone through the desk with the attention it deserved. She had opened the drawer and found the key and taken it and packed her garbage bag and left. The house on Millhaven Road had been legally transferred to the LLC. She had no right to enter it. She knew this. But she also knew that there were things in that house that were hers, that she had left in the urgency of eviction and had not been able to take, and she knew that the legal process the attorney had set in motion, slow as it was, had established at least a theoretical basis for the retrieval of personal property. She called the attorney from the sidewalk, on her cracked phone at 44% battery. She explained what she needed. The attorney was quiet for a moment and then said that she would make a call and that Ruth should sit tight. Ruth sat tight on a bench outside a hardware store and looked at the window display of tools and supplies and thought about the pegboard in the back hallway of the farmhouse with its labeled hooks and its tools hanging in their designated places, and she thought about the person who had labeled the hooks in careful pencil, and she thought about what it means to take care of a thing with that kind of attention. The attorney called back in 40 minutes. She had arranged for Ruth to retrieve personal property from the house on Millhaven Road the following morning, accompanied by the attorney's paralegal, who would serve as witness. The LLC's representative had agreed. Ruth had 1 hour. 1 hour was enough. She went the following morning with the paralegal, a young man named Marcus who was quiet and competent and did not make the experience more difficult than it needed to be by talking. She went through the house in the systematic way she went through things that mattered, starting from the front and moving back, taking what was unambiguously hers, the things she had brought to the marriage and the things that were personal in the way that cannot be disputed. She did not take more than was clearly right. She had her list. She went to Dale's desk last. She opened the drawer she had opened on the last evening. She went through it with the full attention it deserved this time, removing each item and examining it before replacing it or setting it aside. Papers she could not take. A pen she could take. A small notebook she could not be certain of. A photograph she took because she was in it, a photograph of herself and Dale at what appeared to be a family gathering, outdoors, her hair shorter than she wore it now, both of them younger. At the back of the drawer, beneath a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a warranty card for a tool he had bought in 2003, she found it. Another key. Heavier than the gate key, a different profile, the same age and the same design language, the same era of iron as the mortise lock on the stone building's door. She put it in her pocket. She did not say anything to Marcus. She finished going through the desk. She thanked Marcus. She took what she had and she left the house on Millhaven Road for the last time, and she did not look back at it as the car pulled away from the curb. She was going back to the farm. She hired the same car service. She sat in the back seat with both keys in her coat pocket, the gate key and the second key, and she watched the town give way to the county edges and then to the open land the way she had the first time, but it was different now. The first time she had been moving toward an unknown thing. This time she knew the shape of what she was moving toward, or she knew enough of it, and the difference between not knowing and knowing some was the difference between walking in the dark and walking in the kind of early morning light that shows you the outline of things without yet showing you their color or their detail. Enough light to move by. Not yet enough to see everything. The driver left her at the gate. She unlocked it with the gate key, the same smooth turn as before, and she walked the gravel road through the old oaks in the March morning, and the farm opened in front of her the same way it had before, and she stood for a moment and looked at it with the particular attention of someone who is seeing something for the second time and finding that it is more rather than less than it was the first time. She crossed the yard to the stone building. She stood in front of the iron-banded door and she took the second key from her pocket and she looked at it in the morning light. It was heavier than the gate key, as she had noticed when she found it in the desk drawer, and it had the specific weight of a key made to open something that was meant to stay closed except when the right person opened it. She thought about the person who had made this lock and this key, the craftsman of another era who had understood that some things needed to be secured and had built the security to last. She thought about Robert Voss putting this key in whatever place he kept it, and she thought about how it had traveled from that place to Dale's desk drawer, and she thought about what it meant that it had traveled that far and no further, that it had not opened this door when Dale tried to claim the property, that the court had stopped him and the key had gone into a drawer and stayed there while the farm sat behind its gate in its holding status for 13 years, waiting. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The lock opened. The door was heavy and she put her shoulder into it and it moved with the groan of hinges that had not turned in a very long time, a sound that was almost a voice, the sound of something sealed for years releasing itself into the open air. She pushed it fully open and stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the interior light, which was the filtered dimness of a stone room with no windows, lit only by what came through the open door. She had her phone. She turned on the flashlight. What she saw in the first sweep of the light was boxes. Wooden crates, the kind made for storage rather than shipping, built with the same careful joinery as the building that held them, fitted and solid, stacked in rows that ran the full length of the room. She counted the rows. 4 rows, each one 4 crates deep and 3 crates high. The crates were sealed, their lids fastened with the kind of barrel bolt that could be opened from the outside, which was the choice of someone who intended the contents to be accessible to the right person and inaccessible to everyone else. She set her phone on one of the crates to free her hands and she opened the nearest one. Inside, nested in straw that had dried to a pale gold over the years but had done its work of cushioning and preserving, were objects wrapped in cloth. She lifted one. It was heavy in the specific way of dense metal. She unwrapped it with the care of someone who understands that things preserved with this much intention deserve to be received with equivalent attention. It was a bar. Gold-colored, stamped on its upper face with markings she could not fully read in the light from her phone, but that included a date and a weight designation and what appeared to be an assay mark of the kind she had seen in photographs but never in person. She set it down carefully and unwrapped another. The same. And another. She counted the bars in the top layer of the open crate. 12. She looked at the other crates and understood without opening all of them that the rows contained not only the metal bars but other things as well, because the crates at the far end of the room were a different size and shape from the ones near the door, and one of them, the one nearest the east wall, was not fully latched and its lid was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the edge of something that was not metal but paper, old paper, the buff color of documents aged without deterioration. She went to the unlatched crate. She lifted the lid. Inside, organized with the same care as the bars and their straw, were folders. The kind of archival folders used for document preservation, acid-free, the color of old cream, each one labeled in the careful formal script she recognized from the farm's desk papers. She lifted the top folder and opened it. The documents inside were land deeds. Not for the farm on County Road 7 but for other parcels, adjacent parcels, and non-adjacent parcels, a dozen properties in total spread across 2 counties, each deed recorded and certified. She read through them with increasing slowness as the significance of what she was holding began to assemble itself into a shape she could understand. The deeds were old, some dating from the 1940s, others more recent, and they were organized in this room deliberately, which meant Robert Voss had understood their value and had chosen to preserve them in the most secure place on his property. She sat down on the stone floor of the building with the folder in her lap and her phone light casting its circle around her, and she thought about Robert Voss. She thought about a man who had farmed this land his whole life and had died without immediate family and had known Dale Calloway for 20 years and had not, in the end, left the key to this building to Dale. Had not given Dale access to this room. Had known him long enough to have given it and had chosen not to. She thought about the private agreement Dale had cited in the probate claim and the court's determination that the documentation was insufficient, and she thought about what it meant that the key had ended up in a desk drawer rather than in this lock. Robert Voss had changed his mind. That was what the insufficient documentation meant. He had made an arrangement with Dale and then, at some point before he died, he had reconsidered and had not updated the legal record in time, had died with the arrangement in place but the key withheld, the stone building locked, the farm in a legal limbo that was not an accident but a decision. A decision made by a man who had changed his mind about who he trusted and had done what he could with the time he had left. She sat on the floor for a long time. Then she stood up and went through the rest of the building methodically. She spent the next 2 hours opening every crate. The gold bars were real, she was certain of that, certain in the way of a woman who is not given to fantasy and who has no incentive to deceive herself. She could not appraise them. She did not know their precise value. She knew they were real and she knew they were many and she counted them carefully, 44 bars in 12 crates. At the bottom of the document crate, the last item she found, was a handwritten letter. It was addressed in the careful formal handwriting she had come to know over the past 2 days to no one by name but simply to whoever opens this door. She read it standing in the stone building with the morning light coming through the open door behind her. It said, "If you are reading this, you found the key that I chose not to give to the man who asked for it. I kept the gate key with the property papers in case someone from the county ever needed access to the land. I kept this key myself until I understood I could not keep it much longer, and then I put it somewhere it would not go to the wrong hands but might eventually find the right ones. I do not know who you are. I know who you are not. Earl Voss built this farm and everything in it, and I kept it for 60 years because it was worth keeping and because the land deserves someone who will keep it. I had no one to leave it to who I trusted with it. I am sorry for that. It is my only real regret. Do right by the land. Whatever else you do with what is here, do right by the land." It was signed, Robert A. Voss, 2008. 1 year before he died. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She stood in the doorway of the stone building and looked at the farm in the March light that was warming now toward midday, and she felt something move through her that was not quite any single emotion but all of them at once. The grief and the anger and the 46 years and the garbage bag and the $23 and the pigeon on the asphalt and the key that had been in a drawer waiting to be found by whoever opened the door. She was whoever opens this door. She had opened it. The months that followed were not simple, and she had not expected them to be. Legal processes involving contested estates and 13 years of unresolved probate and significant assets in uncertain ownership status are not simple by their nature. She brought to the process the same patient, methodical attention she had brought to everything in her life that mattered. She attended every meeting. She read every document before signing it. She asked every question that needed to be asked. The attorney established that the estate of Robert Voss, in the absence of a valid will and with Dale's failed legal claim resolved, had reverted to the county under intestate succession law, but that the county, presented with the letter and the circumstances of how Ruth had come to hold the key, had options that had not previously been on the table. There was a negotiation. It was honest and productive, and at the end of it, Ruth Calloway held clear title to the farm on County Road 7 and to the contents of the stone building, in exchange for a documented contribution to the County Historical Preservation Fund that was appropriate to the circumstances and that she made without resentment because it was fair. The gold bars were authenticated by a firm with offices in the city, 2 appraisers who came on a Thursday in May and spent 4 hours in the stone building with their equipment and their records. The bars were genuine, of the purity and weight their stamps indicated. The total value at market on the day of authentication was slightly over $3 million. She sat in the farmhouse kitchen with the appraisal report in her hands and read the number and then read it again and then set the report down and looked out the window at the yard where the old oaks were fully leafed now in the May green of trees coming into their season. She called Patricia that evening. Patricia cried. Ruth did not cry on the phone because she had already cried in the farmhouse on the first night she had stayed there, lying on the old mattress in the dark and crying in the complete and private way of someone who has held everything together for a very long time and is, for a few hours, alone with what it cost. Dale heard about it through Patricia, who told him because she felt he had a right to know what his choices had produced, though she told him in the careful and final way of a daughter who has decided what she thinks of a man and is not interested in his response. Ruth did not speak to Dale. She had nothing to say to him that the situation had not already said more eloquently than she could. He had abandoned a legal claim to a farm worth $3 million because the court had not moved fast enough for his patience, and he had found a different life more appealing than the waiting required. He had taken $211,000 and left a woman with $23 and a key he did not know mattered. She did not feel triumph about this. She felt something quieter and more permanent, something that was not about him at all but about her, about what it meant to find that the ground beneath you was more solid than you had been told, that the life you had lived had prepared you for exactly this, that the patience and the methodical attention and the willingness to keep looking after the first key did not fit had been equal to the moment when the moment arrived. She moved into the farmhouse in June. She planted the kitchen garden along the south wall, working the soil in the early mornings when the light came in from the east and the farm was quiet around her except for the birds in the old oaks. Craig came in July and stayed 2 weeks, and they worked on the barn together, not repairing all of it at once because some things cannot be rushed, but beginning, which is the part that matters most. Patricia brought her family in August. The grandchildren ran in the yard between the house and the barn, and Ruth stood on the porch with her coffee and watched them and held the mug in both hands the way she held things she did not want to put down. She put Robert Voss's letter in a frame and hung it in the farmhouse kitchen beside the window where the morning light fell across it. Whoever opens this door. She had opened it. She was doing right by the land. She was doing it still. The stone building she left as she had found it, the door repaired and rehung on new hinges, the lock oiled and functioning, the interior cleaned but otherwise unchanged. She went in sometimes in the evenings, alone, and stood in the center of it and felt the particular quality of a space that has held something important and released it. Not empty. Held. She planted peonies along the south wall of the farmhouse that fall. She had always wanted peonies. In 30 years on Millhaven Road she had never planted them because Dale had not liked the way they looked when they were not blooming, and she had deferred to this the way she had deferred to many things over the years without fully examining the cost of the deferral. She pressed 12 bare-root peonies into the prepared ground in October with the care of someone making a decision not just for next spring but for every spring after it. They bloomed the following May. The first year's blooms were modest, as she had read they would be, peonies needing time to establish their roots before producing the fullness they were capable of, but they were there. And the fragrance was everything she had hoped, warm and dense and entirely itself, the fragrance of something planted with intention in good ground that had come back, as such things do, in its own time. She was 72 years old. She was standing in the farm's south garden in the May morning light with a cup of coffee and the peonies opening around her and the farmhouse solid behind her and 60 acres of land in every direction that she was responsible for and equal to. She understood that this was not the ending of something but the full beginning of what she had always been capable of. She had simply needed the ground beneath her to be the ground it actually was. She had found the key. She had opened the door. What remained was hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.